All right, well, welcome back to another episode of Unlearn with us. And I'm very excited today to have my guest here. This is Ella Lake. Welcome,
Hi.
Ella. Awesome. So happy to have you. I had the fortunate experience of having you on our podcast for the Social Change Makers already. Seems like almost like a month ago now. It's so
Yeah,
crazy.
I think so.
But yeah, I found Ella on a list of people who were attending a conference held by Arrow, the Alternative Education Resource Organization. And Ella, were you giving a workshop, or were you just in attendance?
No, I was just in attendance. Uniting for Children and Youth paid
Right.
to go and watch some of the speakers that they had.
Yeah, and it was an amazing weekend with lots of really transformative and progressive ideas for education. And the organization itself is American, so I was kind of sifting through all the names on the spreadsheet of people that were participating, and there were a few from Canada. And then I realized that Ella was from sort of my neck of the woods, kind of. I'm south of Ottawa, and you're north of Ottawa. And we connected, and like I said, we had her on the podcast, and she's got amazing things to say about education and all kinds of things. So we're going to get right into that. So again, welcome, Ella, and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm super excited. Currently 15. Not for long though. Turned 16 in less than a month.
Ooh,
That's very important.
Yeah.
I guess I know there's like a whole bunch of labels around like homeschooled, unschooled, all of that stuff. I'm not in school. I kind of do my own thing. So whatever you want to call that. I'm super passionate about all things education and social justice, especially the links between existing issues and addressing systems of oppression rather than just individual issues. I live in the Chelsea-Elmer region, so near Ottawa, but what's actually unceded Anishinaabe territory, which I think is very important because there is no document that says, settlers are allowed to, that have a right to be here and legislate this land. And we'll get into that later. But
Awesome.
I'm a student before everything else. I love learning. I'm a co-founder and organizer for Chelsea Youth, which is a youth group based in Chelsea. We talk a lot about addressing climate change, but environmental issues through community building. We actually organized a panel in October of 2019 called The Role of Small Communities in the Climate Crisis. It's available on YouTube. It was a really, really, really great panel, and we talked a little bit more about, the power that small communities, whether that be like municipalities or just your own community, have to make large-scale change by changing our not lifestyles, because I have a big issue with people being like, oh, individual lifestyle changes are what needs to happen, because when we look at carbon emissions and all of that stuff, like the issue is like the military and like the small subset of corporations and all of that stuff. But when we build strong communities that aren't, then we can move away from depending on all of those things. So anyways, that was what the panel is about.
Yeah.
I'm a youth water leader with Ottawa Riverkeeper, and I do miscellaneous organizing where I feel I can be helpful, which is a lot of like social media oriented stuff, helping other groups with their social media and doing my own social media rants. I left school just last year. Last year, after I had a major flare-up in a couple of my illnesses and wasn't able to make it to school for the second half of the school year after Christmas, basically. I have absence epilepsy, which is a kind of epileptic seizure which causes brief lapses in consciousness, but just in consciousness, which is not like a lot of other seizures. Well, the main kind of idea around seizures, one is that there is tonic-clonic seizures, which is the convulsive kind of seizure that is the one that most people think of. But there's a huge variety of what are actually seizures and non-epileptic seizures. Absence, brief lapses in consciousness. Most people can't tell when they happen, which is a whole thing, because I'm like, hey, I missed out on 7 seconds of what you're saying. I'm a tiny bit disoriented. Sorry, just seized. There you go. I get a little bit disoriented, but it's not dramatic, which often leads to people with those kinds of seizures struggling to get access and the support they need, especially in classrooms, often misdiagnosed, or, I know even with a diagnosis, I was often told off in class for not paying attention, even though I was a very dedicated student. Where you're not paying attention, you're drifting off, because people aren't able to identify that it's a seizure when it's not as dramatic. Anyways, probably going to happen quite a bit while I'm here, so figure I'd let everyone know. I have vocal and motor tics, which might happen also, so yay. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is what flared up last year really, really badly, and meant that I was bedridden and couldn't make it to school. And I think this is important bringing up when I talk about all my stuff around school, because, I still completed my school year, my marks went up, but I wasn't able to physically be in school. And with the understanding that everyone learns differently, and that I'm in no way saying that people should do what I did because it worked well for me, but it's not for everyone. It was just kind of proof to me that, hey, I can be really, really sick, and this isn't actually something that I need to feel like I'm growing and learning and doing well, even by standards that I don't actually. Sorry.
All good.
Yeah. What was I saying?
So you were just talking about how you left school and you could still be sick and be successful without the standards.
Right. I think there's a certain amount of imposed standards of like what your academic progression should look like. And I think that's like a whole thing that we can get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
But that for me, it ended up being an opportunity, because I was able to prove to myself that I don't actually need this. And I think that's something that's lacking, especially when we talk about like teenagers leaving school, is that, it's not only are the systems not in place to make that accessible in any way, but also like proving to yourself that you're able to do something a certain way, and having those like 7 months, including the summer, to kind of figure out what I wanted in the first place is not the time that is given to most people. And a lot of my homeschooling friends who have left school after being in high school, they've left school after having some sort of medical, like they couldn't be in school, and then they decided, you know what, this is it. So I think that giving that time to, kind of figure out what you want and prove to yourself that you are able to do it, is really important. And I know that's something that like people have actually studied, the like deschooling process. But I think it kind of sucks that comes out of like medical emergencies so often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyways.
Yeah. The bit about you.
The bit about me.
Yeah. And I have to keep remembering that you're only 15, almost 16, I guess.
Almost 16.
Almost
yeah.
16. It's
Yeah.
crazy. And you've got so much to say. So yeah, so our next sort of question, I mean, you started to kind of give some information about your educational experience. So what, like, even before you left school, what was your experience with school? Like, did you love school? Did you, yeah, how did that all go down?
I went to a Montessori school in elementary school, which I really, really liked. I've always been very, really, I didn't like school. I struggled a little bit with like the social aspect of things, but I've always really loved learning, always had my nose in a book, like all of that stuff, very integral to my personality. So in elementary school, I had a good time. I think a big part of it was up until about grade 6, I really felt like I left school feeling like I had learned something every day, or that, I'd explored something new, or that, I was going to discover something big. And I think that's kind of where elementary school excels, where when you're really learning, like when you're learning how to read and how to write and like the basics of math and all of that stuff, like every step feels like such a big achievement. And so I liked elementary school. And then I live in Quebec, so high school starts in grade 7, Sec 1. And I wanted that high school experience that we're all promised and is so romanticized. And I was in the IB program. So IB program, Sec 1, that year was pretty good. I think it was very exciting. It was all very new. I have always worked really, really well within the school system, other than the struggling to balance it with being disabled. I have the brain that works within school, which is something that I was always very grateful for, because I had a lot of friends who were struggling with that, and I'm just like, I love the aesthetic. I don't know I don't know how else to explain it, but I did pretty well in Sec 1. I was starting to feel like it was taking up a lot of my time. And I think that was my main frustration, because, between, especially in the IB program, between all day at school and then homework and traveling back and forth. And at the time I was swimming competitively, so there was really no time to do anything else. And so I think towards the end of the year, I was starting to feel quite tired, just burnt out. And then as I went into grade 8, that's when I started seizing. And there were some big social shifts that year. And I think that's kind of when it first started to be like just a really negative experience. And I realize I'm quite lucky for that I had such like it wasn't great, but overall positive leading up to that. I mean, I'll go off into a little thing about, once again, epilepsy. At the time, didn't know any other person who had seizures or who had epilepsy. And so being like freshly 13 in a very intense program in school, with this very isolating newly found disability was really difficult, and very isolating. And this is why I talk so much about and make it, it's like at the forefront of my ideologies now, is like all the disability and epilepsy stuff, because looking back, I didn't want to ask for accommodations. I got an IEP really, really late in the year, but after like forcing myself through all of the stuff without one, and my marks did pretty okay, which means I wasn't like at risk, but I was miserable and exhausted. And we even had tests like where they show you like a video and you get to like watch it like 2 times, and then you have to fill out a comprehension thing about it. But that was like a really important test, and if I seize, then I miss that information, right? And so that was a really stressful test. And I remember doing everything I could to make sure I didn't seize during those tests. And my teachers knew, but knew that I had epilepsy, but without the understanding of like what that means for me specifically, because everyone experiences these things differently. It meant that I didn't get those accommodations, and I was too ashamed at the time to ask for those accommodations. And so I think it was one of those things where, like, for me, because I could pass as not needing accommodations, though it was very harmful for me, it didn't show up for anyone else. And I think that's something that happens a lot in the school system, where kids will really be struggling, but when it's not affecting those around them, the energy isn't there to help them necessarily. And also, like, considering the stigma around epilepsy, I didn't want to have to explain to the other kids why I didn't have to take that test, which was part of not needing the accommodations, or not wanting the accommodations. So that was the whole thing. And then, my health got worse and worse and worse until I was missing a lot of school because of other things too. And then eventually I had my big thing last year, and that leads us to where we are here now. So it's overall been very odd, I think, for me, because the main thing that led me to leaving school was being sick and disabled, because I'm able to function well within those kinds of systems. Even though I may not like it, it's not, it didn't impact me as negatively as I saw it was impacting some of my peers.
Yeah. Do you think because, you had to deal with this, and even though, prior to you having the diagnosis and dealing with the seizures, did it give you maybe a little bit more of an understanding of what it was for those people who don't do well in the system?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I think like, generally with empathy, you can be like, oh yeah, not everyone learns the same. But suddenly when you're put into, like, you yourself are put into a position where you're like, oh, I'm struggling within this system, and that changes a lot, right?
Yeah.
I hope it makes me more effective of an advocate for that sort of thing. Yeah, I think I'd like to point out, though, that there are two models of disability. There's the medical model and the social model, and the medical model blames it on the person, in the sense that it's like, no matter what it is, it's like it's disability, something you need to fix, versus the social model sees that a person struggling because of a disability may be because of the way the systems around it are created. And so obviously within the medical model, if your disability comes from illness, like it is for me, like, I want to manage pain, I want to manage fatigue, I want to manage all of those things and get healthier for myself. But within that, if I'm struggling within the system, that is not because I am sick, it is because the system itself is built against that. And I think that's something we see quite a bit in the school system, where it's like, okay, we have IEPs, but why is the system that's supposed to be for education built in such a way that if your brain functions even a little bit differently in a way that isn't actually like a painful or an illness, that you're struggling to learn, because that's not your fault, that's the fault of the system.
That's, again, I have to remind everyone, this is a 15-year-old speaking to you. This is crazy. That is, I've never actually heard that, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So the next questions I ask my guests are, what do you think is good about our current system?
Yeah. I thought about this question quite a bit. I think it is readily accessible and readily available and financially accessible, because something we don't address very often, especially in in like the mainstream alternative education circles is it's expensive. It relies often, especially with younger kids, on having one parent who doesn't need to go to work. It often relies on like on expectations from the child that a child may not be ready to do, right? I think within that, that's like, once again, that's a fault of like an overarching societal thing, but having a place where people can learn to read and write and do math and those basic skills, no matter, like, it's obviously harmful in a lot of ways, but it's still in a way that means that most people here at least can have access to it, which is way better than not having access to that at all and not having access to those resources at all. And so when you have things like textbooks and libraries and all of that readily available to the general population, that is a bonus, and something that isn't true for, like, if you just decide to leave school, then suddenly all of that structure of support and childcare and transportation and all of that stuff just is gone, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would agree. I'm starting up this new academy, and I've often thought that I don't want it to be an elitist thing. I don't want it to be, I want to be able to provide this to everyone, because I believe that education is a human right. But even further, I know uniting children, is it for youth? UCY?
Uniting for children and youth,
yes,
I think.
Uniting for children and youth. I know that they have a petition going, right? And they're talking about the fact that education is a human right, but it's not necessarily just education. It is a good education that really is going to make them successful and viable in the workplace or for their future. So
I think that's also something to address too, though, is like, we can talk about and raise awareness about all the different options as far as it comes to education, but when the focus, because of the way our economy works, is on you're educating for a job, right? You're educating so you can get a job, which necessarily sets a timeline and like a skill set and all of these, I think, arbitrary goals to be achieved on a certain timeline, which makes that idea of like actually just learning for the sake of learning and growing for the sake of growing and exploring for the sake of exploring not just not possible, because you can homeschool and especially as like a kid, it's like, great, my kid's exploring, they're learning at their own pace, but like, especially the teenage homeschooling community, we're 15, 16, 17, it's like, okay, we need to have these skills so we can get to university, or these skills so that we can achieve this job. And so we don't like, our economy doesn't allow for any, sorry.
It's okay.
What's happening?
So you were just saying that our economy doesn't allow for us, I think maybe when you're talking about homeschooling.
Yeah, well, we can have homeschooling, but no matter how much we change how we perceive education, we also need to change how we perceive, labor and payment and, the way that people, the way that goods flow through economies. And so I think a lot, usually when you talk about education, it's like very specific, like we need to make it better for our youth. But as someone who's like on the cusp of like trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I get older so that I can survive, and I'm just going to learn and explore and, do things for the sake of doing that, because that in itself is valuable, that we need to change the way things are generally societally to make that actually truly possible. Because, you know, in learning for the sake of learning, curiosity for the sake of curiosity doesn't stop when you turn like 17, right? Like that should be true for everyone. And it turning things, a lot of the time you see people like monetize that however they can, but why should you have to, right? Like that's my thing. I love doing art, not the best artist, right? Like I wouldn't be able to make money off of that, but does that make painting whatever I make any less valuable? And why shouldn't I be able to do that and still have my needs met, right? Like, I guess this idea of like education in the sense of creating like fully rounded people so that they can work just creates like such cognitive dissonance for me. I'm like, what do you mean work? Because there's like, people can work really, really, really hard and still not have the means they need for survival. And I think when the world has the amount of resources we need so that everyone can survive like 3 times over, why is that the case? And I really, really wish that in the alternative education, when they're talking about education and stuff, they would fold that into it and just remove that idea of like educating so that you can work completely. Because how are you supposed to talk about alternative education if you're doing it with the idea of working for pay? And you know, this is an argument I have with adults quite a bit, because they're like, you know, some things in life are going to be hard and you're not going to always have to do, you're going to have to do things you don't always want to do. I'm like, I know that, right? But there's a difference between having to do things you don't want to do and having to do things that are boring, and working really, really hard and being forced into positions like that without your consent, because just for your survival. That was something with school. It's like, you have to learn to do things you don't want to do. It's like, I do things I don't want to do all the time, but I want to also have it within a framework of, oh, I'm choosing this, right? I'm consenting to this. There is an overarching goal here beyond making it through the day. And so whether that's in school, which is like smaller scale, learning how to learn, the argument is like, you have to learn how to do work that you don't necessarily want to do. Okay, but is it work that has a purpose? Right? Like, why are we saying that it's so important to learn how to do unnecessary things that you don't want to do? It's not just that you don't want to do, it's unnecessary things that you don't want to do. And how does that reflect into the actual job market, and, you know, the way that the entire like international political system works? It's kind of that idea of like, well, you have to accept it, that's just the way things are, when you look at it and you're like, that doesn't actually have to be that way.
It's interesting. I've had a couple conversations with other educators, but also kind of looking at my own self right now, about kids who, you know, like you said, you didn't mind school, you did well in it, you know, you probably learned how to play the game and you did a good job at it. But if I'm a student who does not fit the mold, you know, is at school for 6 hours a day doing stuff that they hate all day long, you know, I hope that in life, like you're saying, that yes, you have to learn to do things that you don't want to do all the time. But if I'm living a life where I am doing that all day long, then there's a problem. And, you know, for me right now, I'm spending a lot of time doing a lot of paperwork so that I can get this school off the ground. And do I want to be doing it? No, I don't want to be doing it, because I want to be, my passion is the teaching and the working with the students and whatever. But I'm going to do it because I get to do all that other stuff that comes with it. And you're exactly right in that there is purpose behind it.
Yeah. Well, one of the main things I talked about, especially when I like first left school and like settled into my schedule, was in like September of like that first, like September of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing really, really well physically relative to my usual state.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing all these crazy interesting stuff, which was a lot of work, but it was super interesting and engaging. And I was like, oh wow, for the first time in my life, like cleaning the kitchen and you know, doing my laundry and doing all of those like basic chores, which I had been doing before, but like felt so overwhelming, right? Like you come home from, I'd have to get up at 6 a.m. to get to school, and then I'd be home around 3:30 because of like bus rides and stuff, and get home, I'd crash on the couch and be like, okay, well, now you have to clean the kitchen. It's like, but suddenly this like chore, which is a chore, you know, it's not particularly enticing. Even though you can be like, oh, I actually enjoy having things clean, it still can feel like a block sometimes. As soon as this, all of the unnecessary, forced, no fun labor was gone, the necessary, no fun stuff became a million times easier.
Yeah.
Right? Like it wasn't, I was like, oh, I wasn't just like throwing a temper tantrum about not wanting to clean the kitchen. It was, I was overwhelmed. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot. It's like school is a lot of work, and it's super socially draining, and it's super like intellectually draining, and you get home and you don't want to do other things because you're overwhelmed. And like that makes sense, of course that makes sense. So as far as learning to do things you don't want to do, I'm okay with learning to do things I don't want to do that are necessary. And that means also, for me at least, cleaning out the things in my life that were draining me that didn't need to be draining me.
Yeah.
Right? Because then all that stuff gets way easier. It becomes a non-issue. It becomes, oh, this kind of sucks at worst, and at best it's just like, oh yeah, this is just another thing I have to do today. Yeah.
That makes sense. I listened to a podcast a while ago. It was Don Wettrick on the Started Up podcast, and I can't remember the name of the guest, but he was pretty sure he was a professor in university. And he was concerned, and it goes along with what you're saying, with the fact that in education, we're so focused on just in case learning. Well, just in case you need this, we'll cover this. And just in case you need this, we'll cover this. As opposed to, what do I need right now?
Yeah.
What is just in time learning? You know, like how do we look at what the youth needs right now, and let's work on those skills, like with whatever, like I know you've done like the Ottawa River Keeper and all the different things, right? So it's like, all right, that's what she's into right now. How do we foster the skills that she needs to work on that type of thing? And I think that's how you can get to a more personalized learning environment, right? If you do
but
that.
you know, that also plays into the whole job thing, right? Like if you're learning to be able to survive in this economic system, then learning a variety of things that you may not like can feel and is necessary sometimes, right? Because you can't just explore your curiosity and then figure out, you know, 20 years later, oh, actually super love science, just wasn't into it. Then it's like, oh no, I have to figure out now so that I can survive, right? That this kind of like impending need for survival really, really impacts the way that we can even talk about, you know, what is necessary learning, because you can't just explore your curiosity. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot, and I think is something that also makes leaving school even more inaccessible, especially when like trying to discuss with parents, because they're like, want you to be able to be okay after this. And even though like we have all the proof of like, oh, different thinkers do so well, it's like, no, there's just shouldn't be this need to learn a certain way of being, learn to conform to a certain way of thinking so that you can stay alive. Why is that even a part of the conversation when it shouldn't have to be?
Yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of what's not great about the system in a lot of your, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of your answers. So you're really pointing out and really alluding to this whole concept of unlearning when it comes to, like you said, like the whole picture.
Yeah.
So, and now I'm talking more specific education.
Yeah.
If we are to try and change education to make it more personalized, to really modernize education, what does society need to unlearn? What do they need to be okay with?
Yeah. So I'm gonna make it bigger picture again. You know, I think with school is just like a chunk of like this whole system that makes the world go around right now. And so necessarily it is complicit in a lot of the violence that we see in other aspects of the state. And so whether that be like our curriculums are, you know, biased and Eurocentric in ways that I struggle to even conceive some of the time because it's so deeply in there. And obvious things too, right? Like, you know, growing up in Quebec did 8 years of Nouvelle France, like history, but Nouvelle France history from the point of view of the French and no one else. And the way that I didn't learn anything about anything about world history, didn't learn anything about, you know, the actual conflicts that happened when French settlers arrived. I just learned they came to this land and now we're here and we should be proud. Yeah. And that's like me trying to learn proper history. Now, granted, I left school before we got into all the world history stuff, so I can't speak to that, but it very, like, that stuff shows through. It's not just history, right? Like, it shows up in your language classes and what literatures you decide to study. It shows up in geography classes, what geographies are prioritized. It shows up everywhere. And then you gonna take it another step and talk about like the school to prison pipeline and how like even the existence of the police affects everything. And so I don't really I don't know if there's like here's a list of things to unlearn, and like by no means am I an expert either, right? Like I'm 15, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think when outside of school, if we start to try to intentionally function as ecosystems and kind of rid ourselves of the idea of like the individual, because that's something that's really taught, right? Like you exist as separate from those around you. You exist as separate from the land that keeps you alive, which I think is what leads to a lot of harm that happens, right? Because people don't see themselves as, you know, indebted in a good way to those around them. If we try to intentionally like start building our communities and our interdependence, and giving in the sense not as charity, but just because we understand that we rely on each other to survive, whether that's like a clear direct link or through some loop around through the ecosystem, then I think that would be a massive step for education. If we're talking about education, like beyond everything else, because it then allows a support system for students, for kids to ask for help, for it not to be this like I don't know about other people, but for me at the time it was embarrassing to need an IEP. It was embarrassing to have to tell those around me, hey, my brain works a little bit differently. And I know probably the majority of the class had something else going on, but because we were in our own little bubbles, instead of taught to rely on each other and that it's not a competition, right? That we can really grow from there and become more autonomous. Yeah.
I think that's great. Like,
Yeah.
I love the idea of community.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is like you said, it's not really, who was I just talking to? Somebody was, my last guest was just talking about how, you know, we don't teach people to be human. And I think that's definitely
well,
you're going with that.
I think it's more that we teach people to not be human, because I think it is natural to, you know, want to reach out and to form groups. But something that I hear a lot that I'm very skeptical of once again, the mainstream alternative education community is this idea of like, we can't raise our children in competitive authoritarian environments. And it's like, nobody should be in a competitive authoritarian environment, and that should reflect how you treat those around you as an adult, and that should, you know, reflect what our governing systems look like, and that should reflect what our economy looks like, right? Like if you're concerned about competitive authoritarian environments, then you can start intentionally moving away from hierarchies in whatever environment you're in, because it doesn't make sense to be like, oh, my 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old can't be in a competitive authoritarian environment. Boom, you're 17, 18. Make it work, right? Like that doesn't make sense. And it's the way schools and education is viewed is directly influenced by the structure of the government, the structure of prisons, the structure of policing, like all of that plays together. Oh, I also had written down that obviously biases like racism, ableism, homophobia, all of that need to be addressed and held accountable for in school situations, which they weren't when I was in school. Just even in the sense of like, all of my teachers, to my knowledge, I know all of them were white, and then to my knowledge, all of them were straight and cis. And so trying to, like, that left me mostly represented, but for my peers it wasn't. And I think that even within, if we're going to talk about the school system as it is now, we need to especially uplift and support the teachers who don't fit into those norms and are actually teaching anti-bias, anti-racist work, and, you know, are existing as queer educators in like a grade 6, grade 7, where it's not exceptional, but they just exist, because I didn't have that kind of representation. And I think it's super important. I think one of the super valid places to say, you know, how we educate our children, like, is how we want to see like the world grow up. Because I'm like, no, do the work now. Is that idea of like uplifting and supporting educators who are doing that kind of work intentionally. And I wrote some of my favorite ones down on Instagram. The accounts, there's Teach and Transform, Liz Kleinrock, super cool, super important. anti-bias, anti-racist, I believe elementary school educator. There's teaching outside the binary, A. Schwartz, who's a grade 7 science teacher, and teaching with mixed T, so mix MXT, who's also just like a middle school teacher doing very important work. So those are some of my favorites.
Awesome.
I'd share.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe could you send me those and we'll put them in the link below for everybody to check out. I want to follow.
Yeah, for sure. There's a whole network of educators. I think all of these people are located in the state, but there are networks of educators who are trying to make their classrooms accepting and actively anti-bias and anti-ism spaces, which I think is really important, both for creating truly accepting spaces for students and making sure those who are growing up not accepting because of whatever their parents are feeding them, then see something different, right?
Yeah. That's amazing. Oh my goodness, such amazing stuff. We're coming to our end here, and we asked you this on the podcast. So I'm asking everybody because we value, our brilliance and what we're good at. So we want to know what your superpower is.
I think I'm gonna say the same thing that I believe I said on the podcast, which is I'm quite proud of my organizational skills. I think it's where I excel, and I hope that it helps me. It lets me create my own space in movements, because when I am not qualified or should not be the person speaking, I can still contribute in a way that helps other people, and I really like that sort of thing. And yeah, I like my secretary aesthetic.
I might have to hire you. Awesome. Well, if people want to see what you're doing, I know you've got Instagram and you've put lots of really great stuff out. Where can they find you?
My Instagram, which is at lake123. That's where I'm most active. With being sick, a lot of the time it tends to be where what I am doing, what I'm feeling is most visible, because it's accessible. It's something I can do from bed, right? I think we often dismiss social media as being inherently performative, which then in turn dismisses like the stuff that disability advocates and justice workers have done throughout the years that has actually allowed like huge strides in human rights for tons of people, because it allows for popular education and all of that stuff. So anyways, that's where I do most of my stuff as of now, on Instagram. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Ella.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I said thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I would bet that we are going to see Ella either as our not next prime minister, but I will be voting Ella for prime minister down the road. That's for sure. She's going to be doing amazing things. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.